So, when you think about the first schools in America, what do you picture? You probably think reading, writing, arithmetic, right? Well, that was part of it, but the real purpose, the fundamental goal behind colonial education, was something way more profound. And the answer might actually surprise you. Let's get into it. And there it is. Seriously, let that sink in. School was meant to save souls. This one idea is the key to understanding everything. Early American education wasn't about getting a good job or creating well-rounded citizens like we talk about today. Nope. First and foremost, it was a spiritual mission. You have to remember, for the Puritans who settled New England, their religious faith drove pretty much everything they did, and education was no exception. For them, the classroom was basically an extension of the church. They truly believed the path to heaven was paved with literacy, and the Bible, well, that was the ultimate textbook for everything: reading, writing, and, of course, how to be a moral person. And just listen to the way they talked about it. They literally believed that if you couldn't read, you were vulnerable to, and I'm quoting here, the old deluder, Satan. So for them, being able to read the Bible wasn't just a nice skill to have, it was a form of spiritual protection, almost like spiritual warfare. And this belief was so incredibly powerful that it would eventually lead to the very first public education laws in America. Okay, but before those big laws came into play, how did a regular kid actually learn anything? Well, the reality was a mess. It was this total educational hodgepodge, a completely fragmented system of informal learning that really just depended on who you were and where you happened to live. For most kids, their education started at home. Pretty straightforward. Then, if they were lucky, the next stop might be what was called a dame school, which was often just a local woman teaching the basics out of her own house for a small fee. After that, though, the paths split wide open. Boys were usually sent off to an apprenticeship to learn a trade, while girls were pretty much expected to stay home and master domestic skills. And that whole apprenticeship thing, it was a really big deal. The master wasn't just a boss. They legally served in loco parentis, a Latin phrase that literally means in place of the parent. This meant they were on the hook not just for teaching a trade, but also for making sure the apprentice learned to read and write. I mean, a kid's entire future could rest on the shoulders of that one person. Now, you can probably guess that this hodgepodge system led to some wildly different outcomes. It was totally inconsistent. So the Puritans back in Massachusetts realized they needed some kind of formal structure to make sure their whole soul-saving mission was actually working. And that led to a really groundbreaking piece of legislation. It was famously known as the Old Deluder Satan Law, and it basically mandated public education for the very first time. The rules were pretty clear. If your town had 50 families, you had to hire a teacher. If your town grew to 100 families, you had to set up a Latin grammar school. And this is so important. The goal here wasn't just basic literacy anymore. It was about creating a pipeline to prepare boys, and only boys, for university and for leadership positions, especially as ministers. And that brings us to the difficult and unavoidable truth about this whole system. Because while it was revolutionary in some ways, it was also designed from the very beginning to reinforce the social order that already existed. It was, to put it plainly, anything but equal. Let's just break this down, because the reality is pretty stark. If you were a wealthy white boy, your path was clear: grammar school, university, and then a leadership role. But for literally everyone else, girls got a basic education, then were funneled into homemaking. Poor white kids could sometimes get schooling, but only if their family took a really humiliating pauper's oath. And for Black and Native American children, education was almost completely denied, and in many cases, it was explicitly prohibited by law. And as if all that wasn't enough, on top of your social status, your race, and your gender, your education also came down to your address. The experience of a kid growing up in the northern colonies was worlds apart from a kid in the South. So how did that actually play out? Well, in the North, you had these dense Puritan towns, which made setting up community schools pretty practical. But the South was completely different. It was mostly rural, with a society built around a plantation economy. So there, wealthy kids got private tutors, while poor white kids and enslaved children, who were scattered all over the countryside, got little to no formal education at all. It's really easy to look at all this and think of it as ancient history. But the truth is, the DNA of this colonial system, it's still very much present in our schools today. The foundational arguments and the inequalities they created are still echoing through our modern education system. I mean, just think about some of the biggest debates we have in education right now. The role of religion in schools, the huge funding gaps between wealthy and poor school districts, the ongoing fight to tear down systemic barriers based on race, class, and gender. All of these are the same central, unresolved problems that were passed down to us directly from the colonial era. So at the end of the day, what we're left with is this dual legacy. On one hand, the colonial era gave us some incredible ideals we still cherish. Things like local control over schools, tax-supported education, and the idea that schooling should be compulsory. But on the other hand, it baked profound inequality right into the foundation of the entire system.
And that leaves us with a question that is just as urgent today as it was hundreds of years ago. We've inherited both the best ideals and the deepest flaws of that first system. The challenge, for them and for us, is still the same. How do we finally make good on the promise of an equal educational opportunity for every single child?